Hello and welcome to another First Chapter Friday. Today we are going to read, it's not actually the first chapter, we're just going to read the prologue for Eragon. Prologue, Shade of Fear. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. A tall shade lifted his head and sniffed the air. It looked human except for his crimson hair and maroon eyes. He blinked in surprise. The message had been correct. They were here. Or was it a trap? He weighed the odds and then said icily, "Spread out. Hide behind the trees and bushes. Stop whoever is coming, or die." Around him shuffled 12 Urgals with short swords and round iron shields painted with black symbols. They resembled men with bowed legs and thick brutish arms made for crushing. A pair of twisted horns grew above their small ears. The monsters hurried into the brush, grunting as they hid. Soon the rustling quieted and the forest was silent again. The shade peered around a thick tree and looked up the trail. It was too dark for any humans to use, but for him the faint moonlight was like sunshine streaming between the trees. Every detail was clear and sharp to his searching gaze. He remained unnaturally quiet, a long pale sword in his hand. A wire-thin scratch curved down the blade. The weapon was thin enough to slip between a pair of ribs, yet stout enough to hack through the hardest armor. The Urgals could not see as well as the shade, and they groped about like blind beggars, fumbling with their weapons. An owl screeched, cutting through the silence. No one relaxed until a bird flew past. Then the monsters shivered in the cold night. One snapped a twig with a heavy boot. The shade hissed in anger, and the Urgals shrank back motionless. He suppressed his distaste. They smelled like fetid meat and turned away. They were tools, nothing more. The shade forced back his impatience as the minutes became hours. The scent must have wafted far ahead of its owners. He did not let the Urgals get up or warm themselves. He denied himself those luxuries, too, and stayed behind the tree watching the trail. Another gust of wind rushed through the forest. The smell was stronger this time. Excited, he lifted a thin lip in a snarl. "Get ready," he whispered, his whole body vibrating. The tip of his sword moved in small circles. It had taken many plots and much pain to bring himself to this moment. It would not do to lose control now. His eyes brightened under the Urgal's thick brows, and the creatures gripped their weapons tighter. Ahead of them, the shade heard a clink as something hard struck a loose stone. Faint smudges emerged from the darkness and advanced down the trail. 3 white horses with riders cantered toward the ambush, their heads held high and proud, their coats rippling in the moonlight like liquid silver. On the first horse was an elf with pointed ears and elegantly slanted eyebrows. His build was slim but strong, like a rapier. A powerful bow was slung on his back, a sword pressed against his side, and opposite a quiver of arrows fletched with swan feathers. The last rider has the same ferret face with angled expression as the other. He carried a long spear in his right hand and a white dagger on his belt. A helm of extraordinary craftsman wrought with amber and gold rested on his head. Between those two rode a raven-haired elven lady who surveyed her surrounding with poise. Framed by long black locks, her deep eyes shone with a driving force. Her clothes were unadorned, yet her beauty was undiminished. At her side was a sword, on her back a long bow with a quiver. She carried in her lap a pouch that she frequently looked at as if to reassure herself that it was still there. One of the elves spoke quietly, but the shade could not hear what was said. The lady answered with obvious authority, and her guards switched places. The one wearing the helm took the lead, shifting his spear to a readier grip. They passed the shade's hiding place, and before the first few Urgals without suspicion. The shade was already savoring his victory when the wind changed directions and swept towards the elves, heavy with the Urgal stench. The horses snorted with alarm and tossed their heads. The riders stiffened, eyes flashing from side to side, and then they wheeled their mounts around and galloped away. The lady's horse surged forward, leaving her guards far behind. Forsaking their hiding, the Urgals stood and released a stream of black arrows. The shade jumped up from behind a tree and raised his right hand, shouting, "Garzla!" A red bolt flashed from his palm towards the elven lady, illuminating the trees with a bloody light. It struck her steed, and the horse toppled with a high-pitched squeal, plowing into the ground chest first. She leapt off the animal with inhuman speed, landing lightly, and then glanced back for her guards. The Urgal's deadly arrows quickly brought down the other 2 elves, and they fell from noble horses, blood pooling in the dirt. As the Urgals rushed to the slain elves, the shade screamed, "After her! She is the one I want!" The monsters grunted and rushed down the trail. A cry tore from the elf's lips as she saw her dead companions. She took a step towards them, then cursed her enemies and bounded back into the forest. While the Urgals crashed through the trees, the shade climbed a piece of granite that jutted out above him. From his perch, he could see all of the surrounding forest. He raised his hand and uttered, is the trolley, Botek. A quarter-mile section of the forest burst into flames. Grimly, he burned one section after another until there was a ring of fire, a half-league across, in an ambushed sight. The flames looked like the molten crown resting on the forest. Satisfied, he watched the ring carefully in case it should falter. A band of fire thickened, contracting the area that the Urgles had to search. Suddenly, the shade heard shouts and a coarse scream. Through the trees, he saw 3 of his charges fall in a pile, mortally wounded. He caught a glimpse of the elf running from the remaining Urgles. She fled toward the craggy piece of granite at the tremendous speed. The shade examined the ground 20 feet below and then jumped and landed nimbly in front of her. She skittered around and sped back to the trail. Black Urgle blood dripped from her sword, staining the pouch in her hand. The horned monsters came out of the forest and hemmed her in, blocking the only escape routes. Her head whipped around as she tried to find a way out. Seeing none, she drew herself up with regal disdain. The shade approached her with a raised hand, allowing himself to enjoy her helplessness. Get her. As the Urgle surged forward, the elf pulled open the pouch, reached into it, and let it drop to the ground. In her hands was a large sapphire stone that reflected the angry light of the fires. She raised it over her head, lips forming frantic words. Desperate, the shade barked, Garjla! A red ball of flame sprang from his hand and flew toward the elf, faster than an arrow, but he was too late. A flash of emerald light briefly illuminated the forest, and then the stone vanished. Then the red fire smote her, and she collapsed. The shade howled in rage and stalked forward, flinging his sword at a tree. It passed halfway through the trunk where it stuck, quivering. He shot 9 bolts of energy from his palm, which killed the Urgles instantly, and then ripped his sword free and strode towards the elf. Prophecies of revenge, spoken in a wretched language only he knew, rolled from his tongue. He clutched his thin hands and stared at the sky. The cold stars stared back, unwinking, and otherworldly watchers. Disgust curled his lips before he turned back to the unconscious elf. Her beauty, which would have entranced any mortal man, held no charm for him. He confirmed that the stone was gone, then retrieved his horse from its hiding place among the trees. After tying the elf into the saddle, he mounted the charger and made his way out of the woods. He quenched the fires in his path, but left the rest to burn. Alright, and here's the synopsis. One boy, one dragon, a world of adventure. When Eragon finds a polished blue stone in the forest, he thinks it is the lucky discovery of a poor farm boy. Perhaps it will buy his family meat for the winter. But when the stone brings a dragon hatchling, Eragon soon realizes that he had stumbled upon a legacy nearly as old as the Empire itself. Overnight, his simple life is shattered, and he is thrust into a perilous new world of destiny, magic, and power. With only an ancient sword and the advice of an old storyteller for guidance, Eragon and the fledgling dragon must navigate the dangerous terrain and dark enemies of the Empire ruled by a king whose evil knows no bounds. Can Eragon take up the mantle of the legendary dragon riders? The fate of the Empire may rest in his hands. Alright, if you are interested, we do have this in the library in the fantasy section.